Okay, welcome to everyone who's tuning into the webinar this evening. Thanks for joining us. We welcome you to our expert panel discussion on breaking barriers to AI adoption in healthcare, brought to you by IntelliHQ, AI Advance, and the Queensland AI Hub. So we're just going to give a minute to let everyone come into the event. It does take some time for people to pop in, so we'll just continue in a moment. We have someone saying good morning, so it looks like we've got some international guests, which is great. Good morning. We're coming to you from Australia, so it's evening for us here. Good early morning from Canada. Fantastic. Alrighty, so we'll get into it now. Before we start, I would just like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet. So that's all over Australia, and also obviously there's people all over the world, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. And I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are here today with us. So welcome to our expert panel discussion. Thanks for joining us again. So my name is Steph Chaousis. I'm the Medtech Program Manager for the Queensland AI Hub. And I'm also Partnerships Manager at Datarwe, but I have my Queensland AI Hub shirt on or hat on today. So today we have a fantastic group of experts who are going to have a really interesting discussion about what are the barriers to bringing AI into the healthcare system. I'm sure as everyone here is aware, AI has a lot of potential to really improve many different systems, but the healthcare system has been slower to adopt AI, and I think that we're all excited to see what sort of promises can be fulfilled by bringing AI into the healthcare system. So we're going to just discuss that today. I will introduce you to our esteemed guests, speakers today. So we have Professor Meng Law joining us. Professor Meng Law is a Director of Radiology and Nuclear Medicine with the Alfred Health, Professor of Radiology, Neuroscience, Electrical and Computer Systems Engineering with Monash University, and Director of iBRAIN, Integrative Biomedical Research in AI and Neuroimaging Lab. Then we have Associate Professor Claire Sullivan with us today. So Claire Sullivan leads the Queensland Digital Academy Research Group at the Centre for Health Services Research, the University of Queensland, at the University of Queensland. She's a Fellow of the Royal Australian College of Physicians and the Australian College of Health Informatics and the Australasian Institute of Digital Health. Then we also have Tobias Ridgen with us today. I hope I said that okay. So Tobias is a co-founder and CTO of Chiron Medical. So Chiron Medical Technologies is a medical imaging company that uses advanced machine learning technologies to develop and provide intelligent tools for radiologists and radiology departments, imaging centres and hospitals to improve the efficiency, consistency and accuracy of radiology reporting. Then we also have Dr. Russell Canaven. So Russell is the Director of Digestive Health for the Gold Coast Hospital and Honorary Professor for Aberystwyth University in Life Sciences. Also joining us today is Elliot Smith, who is the founder and CEO of Maxwell Plus. So Maxwell Plus is a company helping men access AI-driven prostate cancer testing. And so after completing his PhD at the University of Queensland, Elliot founded Maxwell Plus after seeing huge issues with the rates of early and accurate detection. And then also we have Peter Raddy here with us. So Peter Raddy is the co-founder of AI Advance, who is supporting this event, a Melbourne and Auckland-based artificial intelligence consultancy and advisory service for medical imaging in public health, private practice, cancer and immigration screening services in Australia and New Zealand. So welcome to all our panelists. Thanks for joining us. So I'd love to start off just getting a statement from each of you on where you think AI in healthcare is currently. So love to hear from you first, Peter.
Okay, thanks, Steph. I actually think it's at quite an exciting stage. There's now a number of clinically proven commercial applications appearing in the imaging space. There's quite a few university hospitals around Australia like Professor Law at the Alfred, which are implementing commercialized AI applications and doing lots of research. There's lots of very solid business cases around at the moment, particularly when people are looking at applications. But yeah, the level of research locally is quite astounding. And yeah, when you look overseas, they're probably several years ahead of that. And it's yeah, it's a very exciting time for us, and we feel like we've come into this at the right time. It's all a great burgeoning industry, and we're finding, particularly in radiology, is probably leading healthcare in AI at the moment.
Yep, excellent. And Elliot?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with that. It's an exciting time to be in AI in healthcare. I think we've reached the stage where AI is here to stay. It's definitely part of the doctor's toolkit. And what excites me is that we're now starting to ask questions about user experience with AI and how it interacts with patients and really fits into the full clinical workflow, not just if it's going to be a useful tool, which I think is, the next exciting phase of AI in medicine. But it's certainly here, and I think it's here to stay.
Cool. And Russell?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's an exciting time. AI has been a long time coming for people interested in statistics and stuff. The universities are way ahead. The medical schools have been helping them embed it, certainly down here in Griffith. It's patchy because the types of problems being solved are the ones that lend themselves to AI. But it's definitely finding its niche. It's definitely finding the governance pathways through now, and definitely hitting the ground with actual patients. And I agree, Australia's a great place to be, being the foreigner.
Great. And Claire?
Yeah, look, I think it's no longer a question of will we use AI? It's a question of how do we use AI? And I think what we're grappling with is how does that actually become part of routine clinical care? So the use cases which are really spearheading the situation at the moment have very simple workflows. No disrespect to my good colleague and radiologist, Meng, but the radiology workflow is relatively simple, as opposed to, for example, an endocrinology ward round, where you've got all sorts of, and Russell's laughing, I'm sure the gastro ward rounds are just a simple, Russell. But we've got complex variables, you've got real-time in a way that doesn't happen in the fixed diagnostics. So I think we've got a way to go in terms of complex therapeutics. And I guess that's where my interest lies, is shifting away from fixed data sets or relatively simple workflows to actually using AI as a tool for dynamic data sets in real time in complex clinical scenarios, which is where we actually really need help in making decisions. So very exciting.
Awesome. And Meng?
I agree with what everybody has said, and I think that not only are we in a very exciting time in Australia, but much like a lot of different things around the world, we lag behind a little bit. But that's, I think, probably a good thing in the sense that the last time I was out of the country was February last year when I was in the States, and a friend of mine drove me from downtown Los Angeles to LAX and had a Tesla. And they've activated their automatic driver pilot and literally drove in the busiest freeway in America, downtown Los Angeles to LAX, and had our eyes closed. And so we haven't adopted that in Australia, much like we haven't adopted the vaccine yet for another month or so, and it's probably a good thing because we'll wait for the Americans and the Europeans to show us the side effects and any potential deaths, and then we'll go ahead. So I think it's probably a good thing. I think we're at the point now where we're starting to see what the potential gains and advantages are, and what the potential drawbacks are from experiences around the world.
Interesting point. Thank you. And Tobias?
Yeah, maybe not surprisingly, I also think we're at a very exciting stage for AI and healthcare. I think what's also become clear last year is that the pandemic has really laid bare the need to make healthcare more affordable and more sustainable. And I think AI is particularly well suited for that. Although I think the pandemic in its own right will present challenges for AI, because I think a lot of the expectations about data and data distribution has shifted. I think some of what we've seen the last couple of years is a number of real use cases and clinical applications being sort of proven. We've seen some big publications showing the impact of AI. However, I think as Elliot also mentioned, I think now is the time to start asking the questions: how do we turn this into a product? I mean, an AI model is just that. It's a result of a set of data, of compute and algorithms. However, that's not yet a product, and a product is so much more than just an AI model. That requires understanding things like the user experience. It means understanding how a user, how you extract value from that, how it best is deployed, which is a whole challenge in its own right. And that's something that at Chiron we are just embarking on. We're scaling MIA across the NHS on quite a large scale, and just the deployment process and making sure that is safely done for the women, or the women that we are impacting in our case, is something where I'm sure we still have a lot to learn. And I think the next year is going to be incredibly exciting for that.
Fantastic. I mean, it was great to hear basically all positive responses from you all, that, you know, you think it's an exciting time and that there's so much potential and so much research being done even here in Australia, which is fantastic. And I think thinking about the topic of AI adoption in the healthcare system, you know, if we have all this fantastic research, you know, do you think that it's being adopted in the healthcare system? Do you think it could be adopted more quickly? Or perhaps why is it not being adopted? So just sort of thinking about, it's a bit of a couple of questions there, but basically we've got this research. Is it being adopted in the healthcare system? What are your experiences from your different perspectives? I would love to hear, particularly because we have, you know, people from industry and clinicians. So if you want to answer that, starting with Peter again. So we still got you on mute. Oh yeah, there we go. No
Thanks,
worries.
Steph. We're actually seeing a bit of a mixed response, and you're always going to have some people who are quite excited by the new technology and they're quite keen for it, and then you have the other side, you know, where people aren't as keen, and it can be things like people are concerned about their jobs, AI taking over from medical specialists, which isn't the reality. We see AI being adopted as a tool to aid the radiologist in our case, and our cardiologists. So once they see that, we don't really see many barriers. I guess it's really talking to people, talking to the people in healthcare, looking at their actual problems, and leading into what Toby was speaking about before, actually coming in and finding solutions to real problems. And that's what will get people thinking strategically about their purchases. Putting up sound business cases is another thing. And once you can put up a sound business case, you've got your funding, which is always a major issue in healthcare. And then you can start to lead to adoption. And I think if you talk to anyone from the hospitals, and probably Meng Law is the one to talk to on the panel, about how the process they've gone through to adopt commercial AI applications is never straightforward, and it's there's quite a few barriers to overcome. But that's what we've seen so far.
Yeah, fantastic. And then, you know, I'm happy for all of the panelists to jump in with their thoughts as they like.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to jump in here. I think I see similar things to Peter, especially when working with the larger end of the healthcare system, you know, hospitals, especially the public healthcare system, because there is a huge chain of decision makers in any of that new technology adoption. A big reason that we are direct to consumer is because we found it was the fastest way to get this technology to the patients and you know, to the bedside, so to speak. Because we found that the doctors were keen, and the patients were keen, and our product had been proven, but the bureaucracy of working with some large orgs slowed that down. So we decided, I suppose, to take a different approach, and we're seeing more people do that as more and more AI becomes consumer facing, and it'll be interesting to see how that plays out in the long term. But I think the interest is high, but the adoption is probably lagging behind that interest.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I can jump in here as well. I mean, I think it also very much depends on the actual application and value proposition. I mean, in our case, we are used in the breast cancer screening program. It's a sort of a higher risk value proposition, right? Because we actually make a decision whether a woman should come back for screening or not in case there's potentially breast cancer. So, I mean, I think rightfully so, people want to make sure that what they're deploying is safe for women. So the willingness is there, absolutely. And that's also driven by, at least in the UK, a big workflow or workforce shortage. There's a big shortage of trained breast radiologists. So there's a real need to roll this out. However, even though there has been a lot of clinical, there have been some clinical proof points and clinical studies, I think what we see is the hospital leaders and radiologists still want to see sort of some real world evidence on their own data. So starting with pilots to understand, okay, is this actually working for my population, for the women in my screening program, is a very fair question. And that's what I meant with making sure that we have a sort of safe and robust rollout system and process. Because we want to make sure we have the time to gather some of the real world evidence to show to the trusts that, hey, this also works for you, not just in a research paper.
Good point. And I think actually it's funny, as you were speaking, it reminded me of what you mentioned, Meng, about the Tesla not quite being there all the way there in terms of knowing the best route to take. I guess that's a good example of why, in healthcare, if you had an analogous example of that, it's a bit more risky, right? I guess driving a car as well can be life or death, but in healthcare, you can understand why there might be, exactly as you said, Tobias, they want to test on their own populations to be really certain that what are the outcomes that are going to be suggested. So Russell, did you want to jump in? Go for it.
Yeah, I thought I'd kick off the clinical side. I'm sure Claire
Fantastic.
will, because she's being at the brave end in Australia, in Queensland. Healthcare IT is difficult. It really is. I've been doing it. I built databases when I was a medical student, sort of in the 90s, right the way through to now. A lot of the projects that I did in the UK took me 4 to 5 years to integrate every GP system into the hospital system. We need to be very safe and secure and carry the public with us when we do it with a lot of these systems, because you are using particularly sensitive data. And we are even though medical errors happen, we are very fault intolerant of systems. So it is difficult, and integrating any system, I'm sure Claire knows the one I'm trying to do at the moment has just been put on pause because of COVID, and I've spent 4 years trying to get the politics right, to get the funding to do it. And we sort of started it off integrating the endoscopy systems with EMR, and then something else comes along and torpedoes you. So it is frustrating, and it's hard work, and you have to be persistent and remain positive for 4 to 5 years whilst you do it, and not kind of lose heart, which is what I see quite a lot, that people start keen and then give up. It's incredibly expensive. However, and most of the savings that we see are never realized. So they're always sold as a saving in the business case, and we never actually see the savings that are promised in real world dollars. The cost just goes up and up and up. Research and business obviously come from cherry picking the easier ones, because that's what they can get funded and sell. And that's great, because at least stuff's being done. 2011, to say that AI in medicine's new, 2011, I was putting my first AI system in to monitor the staff, and we have to do union consultations. We have to do all these things in order to have the governance and safety that staff are doing the right thing. And only then could we break the glass into the GP systems without the GP consent, by getting every GP in Wales to agree to it. Every patient with radio campaigns, leaflet drops, all the rest of it, in order to just allow a hospital doctor to look at the GP record universally across Wales. So, we have been using them, but we're seeing a creep in systems. I've had a number of people come up to me for use case. I've been working with companies in terms of defining the clinical problems and low-hanging fruits that they probably can do. Radiology is a classic example. Endoscopy, we're just trialing. As I say, it's 4 years of talking to the companies, and we're now seeing 4 different systems that have got TGA approval. And then in that case, it's taken me 4 years of talking, and it's kind of happened. And to me, because I've done a little bit of image rec, it was quite a simple problem to solve. It wasn't complex as a ward round or a healthcare system or any of those things. So it is challenging. The final thing, I guess, is the culture of medicine, which is very much based on diagnosis, inconsistent outcome measures, and the traditional evidence-based medicine paradigm that we follow, which leads you to guidelines. And we're all very comfortable in that space because we understand it. We've done lots of work, certainly at Griffith, but I'm sure at UQ as well, in terms of rejigging the medical curriculum so that the people who probably understood a fair bit of this at the age of 18 don't lose that as they go through medical school and get sort of siloed into a way of thinking. So it becomes part of their everyday thought processes, particularly, and this is one of the things I've always said, is they need to really disrupt the AI when it's not safe, and try and spot when they're having a decision made for them that isn't right. And we've always done that a bit, of find the patient that doesn't fit the guidelines, and it's kind of a disruptive way of thinking. So it is really exciting times, but it's hard work to do. And I'm sure Claire's at the pointy end in Queensland. I don't know, Claire, if you want to, that's a bit wordy, but I don't know if you want to expand on that.
Oh no, that was a beautiful summary. And I think what Russell's alluding to is the fact that an AI algorithm can't be seen in isolation in complex systems. So I think we can see it in isolation for simple workflows such as radiology, but the truly wicked problems have a very complex workflow, complex governance, and a really difficult moving target. And that, I think, is actually where we're going to make the biggest impact with AI. So if we could actually have an AI algorithm that learns in real time alongside us as the patient progresses through her trajectory of illness, that would be a really useful thing to have. So I think we need to shift, and I think we've done some great low-hanging fruit, but now how do we shift across to complex workflows with dynamic data sets, with decision support in real time for complex decision making? It is a step up in terms of the technical capability. It's also going to require continuous maintenance of the algorithm And I think that's something that we're still grappling with, is how to actually maintain the life cycle of algorithms once they're deployed. So I think this is real. I think this is our next step, is to shift into complex workflows, maintain algorithm life cycle, but start to talk about AI in terms of the quadruple aim for healthcare. So rather than simply talking about cost or business cases, I think we actually need to put a quality improvement lens in healthcare across AI. And the quadruple aim, as all of you I'm sure know from the IHI, is better efficiency, a better quality of care, better experience for our consumers and staff, and better population health. And if every algorithm kept those 4 aims in mind, I suspect they'd be more successful, because all 4 are what each clinician, consciously or unconsciously, holds in his or her heart as they go to work every day. So I think we need to mature some of the aims around AI to satisfying the international quadruple aim of healthcare, and start talking to clinicians in terms of the quadruple aim in healthcare, rather than trying to talk to them about cost or efficiency. And I think we'd see greater clinical understanding and an improvement in culture around the AI adoption.
Very interesting. Some great points there. Thanks, Claire. And Meng, would love to hear your comments too. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to ask before I show my 25 PowerPoint slides, the panel, and in particular, I guess, Tobias, Russell, and Claire, how many of your patients and how many of your consumers, and Claire brought this point up, and this is a concept that I think is preventing the widespread adoption. How many of your patients and how many of your consumers are aware that we are actually using AI in endoscopy or in medical imaging? I mean, I can share my experience with you at the Alfred, but I mean, Tobias, how many of the women that are getting mammograms know that the radiologist is using AI to detect cancers?
That's a good question. One of our chief strategy officer, Sarah, has a personal goal that women ask for Mia by name. We're not at that stage yet, but so the way that our product works is that we are one of the readers in the Double Red program. So women will be told, but by definition, when they go to a place where Mia is deployed, Mia is always a reader. The interesting thing of the workflow is that the AI never has the last call, because they read side by side by a normal radiologist, and in the case that they disagree, there will be an arbitrator radiologist. So the final answer is still always a human answer, but we save 50% roughly of the cost of the screening program.
Darren, I don't know if you want to chip in or you want me to. I can talk about endoscopy. So endoscopy's got like a particular quality framework, which is fairly internationally recognized. What we are seeing is, and again, the AI is an adjunct. It's not the decision maker. The decision maker is the endoscopist. And so the clinical responsibility still 100% goes on to the doctor doing it. The polite way of describing it is there's quite significant variation in quality markers in endoscopy. Certain endoscopists have 3 times the rate of finding polyps than others. They meet the international standards, but we know that even in people who've passed the driving test, so to speak, there's quite wide variation. And it's something that we use aggregated data, statistics, retraining. We put a lot of effort into improving the quality of endoscopy internationally for 15 years. You know, we've been pushing this agenda because it's important. And the interval cancers, i.e. the chance of you missing a polyp that before your next colonoscopy turns into a cancer, is significantly different in the same groups that miss the polyps. So the various systems pretty much they're all in the first iteration. they merely point out and they overcall hugely. Like, having used one, it's maybe 10 bounded boxes and a little beep for every one polyp as you're withdrawing slowly. What we have in the early studies in the real world data, and this is where to me it gets more interesting because you're actually improving outcomes, is the worst performing, I'm sorry, I shouldn't say worst, the lower end of the bell-shaped curve performing endoscopists came up to average. So we know, and we're still applying the same quality framework, the same, the same feedback loop to the people who are lower hanging fruit. We're still looking at the same histological outcomes, polyp detection rate, adenoma detection rate, all this stuff that we do to ensure quality endoscopy. And it genuinely will help. In Queensland, we've had some problems in endoscopy recently in Redlands where, multiple patients had to be rescoped because it was found that somebody slipped through the net, and, those poor patients had to, can't remember how many colonoscopies needed repeating, but those patients had to go through it again. So in the trials we've done, I would say no, the patients aren't aware. The business case is problematic because, I've looked at the numbers, and per room, $4,000 or $5,000 a month is crippling for public. It may work in private because you can speed up your polyp detection quicker, so they earn more money, so it might work in private. But I would argue, certainly in this polyp detection system, it would almost be easier to reverse that question and say, why aren't you using it? Because we know that it brings the worst performing up to, the worst performing up to average, which is really what you want, right? But all the rest of our quality framework is staying the same. So, I'm struggling trying to get the business case through at the moment. And it's partly because we've done a lot of that we've done it manually, a lot of that work, retraining people, pushing, but I know there are units, that won't have quite gone as far down that quality framework. So, yeah.
So I completely agree with you, Russell, and I think you're absolutely right. But as a patient who's unfamiliar with algorithms and AI technology, and I can show you examples of surveys that we did of patients waiting in the waiting room, absolutely terrified of the unknown because they don't know what AI is all about. And I think we don't spend the time that you just spent explaining it to us with our patients. But I think that's one of the reasons why adoption is low, because our patients are fearful, and we don't really have a means of educating or engaging our consumers so that they're aware of what we're doing. I think that's a very important step in the application and usage of AI in healthcare.
I would argue even all information governance in healthcare is actually really important to bring the patients on the journey, not just an AI. When I was integrating those records, I had 4 years struggle to, leaflet drops, radio shows, the whole schmozzle to try and engage. I mean, probably 30% actually engaged with the concept, but we couldn't say we didn't try.
Yeah, I mean, I think you are correct, but I think we also have a duty to almost demystify it a little bit. So when I talk to consumers about it, I also point out that every time they open up the courier mail, they're using AI because the newspaper websites will learn about what websites you want to read. Every time you go searching for a holiday, you're engaging with AI. And every time you do a real estate search, you are engaging with artificial intelligence. So it is permeating every aspect of our cultural lives. It is becoming part of the social milieu in which we all exist. So to suggest that we're suddenly introducing them to it in the healthcare system probably isn't quite painting the picture correctly. So we do, I think, need to have a national conversation about artificial intelligence, the way that it is influencing more than just healthcare, and is in fact interacting with us when we try to rent a car. I think the healthcare paradigm, I guess, brings higher stakes, as Russell alluded to, in terms of if we make a mistake. So I do think that whenever we apply a new technique in medicine, whether it be a new diagnostic test, a new operation, or a new medication, that we go through the same rigor. So I would suggest that if I was going to prescribe you a new form of insulin, I would go through the side effects and possible issues. And if we were going to introduce a new AI algorithm, we would go through a similar discussion. So I think it is part of our society, whether we actually are aware of it or not. The application in healthcare requires additional attention and additional consumer empowerment, which I agree, Meng, we're not doing well. Russell, to go back to your business case, this is a common problem. And it's one which we're working very hard with the health economists at the University of Queensland to resolve. And we're actually starting to use some macroeconomic theory or SOGRO theory to actually look at how we can cost up the shadow value. So there is shadow value in what you're doing, Russell. It's not traditional cashable benefits, but there is a value to it being quicker. There is a value to you not worrying about your staff performance that can actually be costed at a unit and then multiplied by an increment and added to your business case. So I think that macroeconomic theory hasn't yet filtered down to new technology business cases. We are certainly starting to look at it now, because when you stack up immediate cashable benefits, you will never win, as Russell says. But if you can start to ascribe shadow value, so not direct project costs, but shadow value, and put that into your NPV, after 5 to 10 years, you start to see a positive value. So I think it's changing a little way, the business case presentation, but new technology requires those macroeconomic theories in order for it to advance, because on microeconomics or financial accounting, they never stack up. So I think there's an added layer of sophistication that we need to start putting into our business cases in order to implement this at scale in big public facilities.
Fantastic. I think it's interesting to look at, all of your answers to that question. What's the barrier? It's not just one thing. The business case, obviously very important in trying to get that value proposition to the healthcare systems, taking up new technology, but then also, interestingly, patients being aware and understanding and trusting the technology, which I think is very challenging because it's not a straightforward answer, and everyone has their own experiences of learning about what AI is and maybe their own prejudices. And then also, getting this sort of technology into the system. Is it really cost effective and all of that sort of stuff? So sounds like there, from your perspective, there are a number of different issues that need to be addressed. And I think, Claire, especially you mentioning the way we talk about it to clinicians in terms of this framework that fits within the healthcare sort of mindset is another one I sort of hadn't thought of as much. That's really interesting. So, and you've sort of answered the second question, which I was going to ask, which is, what do you think needs to change? So we have kind of alluded to that, but I would love to hear any sort of, brand ideas from any of you on how we can really support the advancement of innovation using AI in the healthcare system. And again, happy for anyone to chime in as you think of something.
Steph, is it all right if I just share a couple of slides that I prepared?
Yeah, not a problem.
And I think the attendees might be able to use this for questions and the QA session in the end. But I think that the bottlenecks and the reasons why, and we've discussed some of this already, there is potentially low adoption is, in Australia particularly compared to other countries globally, I think we are always very safe, and I think we're concerned about what might go wrong. Certainly when I presented, every time, Peter shows me some new tools, I'll present it to our radiologists, and they're concerned about the de-skilling of humans if AI can do a lot of what a radiologist or a gastroenterologist can do. And then they're concerned about, being replaced by AI. And then there's still a question, and undoubtedly, as Russell was already alluding to, we know that in many instances, AI is excellent, and the error under the curve is always going to be very repetitive and very reproducible. But there is still, and certainly in our experience in the clinical setting, a lot of instances where there are false negatives and false positives. So, particularly if there are false negatives, that's an issue. So then the way the algorithms are created, they will bend more towards the false positives. So you pick up more false positives rather than miss cancers, if you like. And then there's the issue of a major hot topic in AI now is hidden stratification. And by that, I mean that, we can teach an AI, an algorithm to pick up and learn to find certain abnormalities, but humans are always also taught over years and years of training in medical school and specialist training that there are other things that can actually cloud a diagnosis. For example, a pleural effusion in a patient with a upright chest X-ray will look very different to a pleural effusion in a patient that has a supine chest X-ray, where an algorithm may miss the pleural effusion only because the patient is lying down flat. And so these are things that we still haven't really taught algorithms to learn about yet. And then just finally, just a quick, point about consumer representation and education. This is a survey that we undertook at the Alfred of 300 patients that were sitting in the waiting room, waiting for their X-ray or their scans. And we had 150 and 133 males. Most of them were familiar with technology, and 63% of patients were really unaware that we were already using AI in the clinic, and this was already 2 years ago. And when we asked them, they felt very uncomfortable that we were employing AI to help with our reporting. And not only that, but I think they were concerned about their privacy. But other than that, they were slightly uncomfortable with the fact that the report was generated not entirely by a human, but with the help of AI. And then importantly, I think this goes back to I think Russell brought this point up of who's ultimately responsible. When we surveyed the patients felt that the liability would lie with the hospital in 76% of the cases, would lie with the vendor or the computer company in 61% of the case, with the radiologist in 37% of the case, and then lastly, the referring doctor in 10%. So, I think that that again lends to the point of educating patients is very important. And there are numerous publications now, just this is my last letter I want to share, but in the radiology and other healthcare literature, there's a lot of examples of hidden stratification and how, we need to overcome this. Otherwise, humans will still be ultimately, as Russell says, responsible for the final diagnosis, but still be probably ultimately more accurate and superior to artificial intelligence. So I think those are some points that I wanted to make tonight, and open for panel discussions. And I'm sure there may be some questions from the audience in terms of Q&A at the end.
Yeah, fascinating, and definitely happy for you guys to respond to that. I think it's really interesting. Thanks for sharing those.
Yeah, I'm happy to chime in there. I think Meng, you raise a really, really important challenge that I think is, when I look at the AI research in the healthcare space, this topic is a little bit underrepresented of stratifications and bias in data sets. It's something we take very, very seriously at Current, because our product is working on a population scale, right? It's a screening programs are population based, at least in the UK, which means that you need to be prepared that any kind of person can be exposed to your AI. There's no way, we cannot filter the group of patients that get exposed. And so it's really important that, or what we always say internally, we want MIA to work for every woman everywhere. And that's an incredibly difficult challenge, because the data set that we have used so far to develop our algorithm on has a certain bias towards certain populations. And we're always actively hunting to understand really what are the different sort of clinically relevant and biologically relevant differences in populations, and try to make sure that our data set represents that. But that is a very long journey. And we want to make sure that our product is really safe for everyone to use. So that's also why we have a very careful rollout process and do these pilot tests with all of our sites to make sure that it works for their local population. I think what we and actually governments can play a role here. So the NHS has built the system of the AI awards, which
Oh, I think we've lost him.
That.
Sorry,
I
just
think I
froze for a
cut out
moment.
a second.
Yep,
Yeah.
that's all right.
So I was just saying, in the UK, the NHSX established the AI Awards, which we were one of the recipients of, and this really enables not only us but also the trusts where we want to roll out to do so through funding and other forms of support. And I think this is absolutely key because it allows us to achieve scale much faster, to get a much more representative sample and data set, and really show that we're achieving generalizability, to make sure, again, that we build the safest product that we can, and test all those hidden certifications that may or may not exist.
Mm-hmm. And I guess that relies on you being able to get access to real world data to train and test your algorithms, right? Which is a whole nother conversation, another layer of challenges in the healthcare system is, accessing that data and then being able to run those tests and validate the algorithms. So yeah, interesting point that you brought up there as well. It's something I think we sometimes forget about. We always focus on the end point of building the algorithm and how does it work, but how are we building it and how do you continue getting, helping it grow and become more accurate and applicable to a diverse population. Yeah. Anyone else? Peter, do you have any comments on that?
I'm actually just thinking through that one. I'll handle one of the other ones.
All right, can I come in on that one because
absolutely,
it goes back to something that obviously being an information governance nerd and former Caldecott Guardian, I very much see information governance has always had a bad rep as a barrier. And even in the title of this, there's the kind of barrier. And it's like, no, good governance is actually a safe enabler. It's not a barrier. So, the NHS, bless, I did my 20 years. And, Googling the Royal Free, I actually started in the Royal Free, but it's not related just to AI in any health informatics system, and good information governance does bring people on that journey. It does empower consumers. It does all those things. And sometimes you even have to change the law with the consent of the population. And in government, we have done that. We had to make changes to allow certain things to happen. And that's fine because the population consented to that. So for me, it's not just a legal thing, it's a political thing, and it's bringing everybody on that journey. It's just that's why I keep saying it's a hard thing to do because it takes time to change the law. If you have to change the law, it takes time.
Yeah,
exactly. No matter what you're in. And would love to hear thoughts on given that there are these challenges, and to hear from everyone, what do you think's the way forward? And do you have examples where you feel like, the adoption has gone well? I mean, Russell, obviously you've given us a great one, but would love to hear from everyone. Yeah.
So Steph, I guess one comment is that I'm interested in your endpoint there. So you described the endpoint as being when the algorithm is ready or it's been tested and trained on a data set.
Yeah, and, probably you're calling me out on that. Probably not the endpoint. Yeah, go for it.
So Nature Digital Medicine published last week a set of guidelines for best practice for AI in healthcare. And that's really one of the things that was being called out, is that there is a current practice suggesting that the end of the production is when you validated the algorithm. And in healthcare, that's really the start.
Yeah.
So I would suggest that a shared understanding, that actually that's just the start. And the real investment now and the real work comes when you actually put it into a complex healthcare system and you monitor your outcomes. And that's when we're really going to see wide scale adoption. So I think that the article is correct. I think that for complex healthcare settings, the endpoint is not, it works on a real world data set. The endpoint is we've implemented into a healthcare setting, and the outcomes are getting better, patient experience is getting better, quality of care is getting better, and experience is getting better. So keeping that quadruple aim actually as your outcome and your endpoint.
Yeah.
And those things that you're describing, Steph, are very important and critical steps along the way. But to get change in healthcare, you have to have an outcome which is shared and a goal which is shared. And so if that is the, better quality, better experience, then that can only be measured by actually putting it in. You can't measure it on a data set. You can't measure it in the lab. It actually needs to go in. So I think that's the challenge, is actually taking away my algorithm performance as an endpoint. Your algorithm performance needs to be spot on, but your actual outcome is satisfying the quadruple aim of healthcare. And that means actually putting it in and demonstrating that to the clinical teams. And then we will start to break down some of those issues.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that, Claire, and also from the perspective that the governance is continuing, because like any system, and particularly in medical, whether it's you're looking at breast screening or whatever, there's always a QA process to monitor the quality. And I firmly believe the premium commercial applications are doing that. They're doing the clinical trials, and they're not just doing a clinical trial and then stopping and trying to dump product out there. It's a continual change process. And you were also speaking before that you'd like to see an AI that continually learns in the medical environment. The regulatory environment currently doesn't allow that. So once a clinical study is done and an algorithm is finalised to begin commercial sales, it's actually locked. It can't keep learning. And when you do further research and you tweak the algorithm with more and better data and improve things because you've been monitoring the QA and governance, you then need to re-register the new algorithm with every single regulatory authority where it's being used. So that's a challenge. It is a challenge, and I guess a barrier, but it's one I support, because you need good regulation in healthcare, because you can't let things run amok, and you don't want to be able to break an algorithm, because otherwise it will suddenly become unreliable, and all the guys who are the specialists in AI will be well aware of that. As long as it's behaving within the boundaries that it was set up to do, that's fine. If those boundaries need to change, you have to change the algorithm. So it's a bit of a dichotomy, I think.
Can I make just a simple illustration of, I think, both your points, using the endo one that we've got? Every time they do a software update, it has to be approved, TGA approved. But to talk about the outcomes, one of the outcomes, or there's the training set, and then we get through that, and then you get TGA approval. But actually, in this endoscopy system, yes, you are showing the system can detect a polyp. The second step is, does it improve the endoscopist's outcome? And we know in some it does, some it doesn't. The next step, which is actually a really big leap given the history of research going into medicine, is to say that we've reduced interval cancers. Because, in the drug world, which is where, before this, lots and lots and lots of money was coming through, lots of research and all the rest of it. For every one new chemical entity, most of them fell by the wayside. And we're going to have to see that at some point as well, that when you actually put it in this complex environment that Claire's talking about, and you take it through those clinical steps to actually change a patient's outcome, it is a long road, and just being able to detect a polyp is not the same as reducing cancer in a population.
Completely agree.
Yeah.
But a couple of things that this makes me think of, I think this real world in the clinic proof of efficacy is a wonderful thing to aim for, and where we should be aiming. I think, though, that we're going to need more systemic changes across the whole medical industry to make that happen. Because if you look at pharma, almost all pharmaceuticals perform worse in the real world than they do in their sort of FDA approved tick of approval situations. And that's been going on for a very long time. So, I mean, in some ways, it's good that these conversations are opening the doors to, I guess, a larger systematic review. But I think it's going to be harder to change the industry overall. And, with the comment on performance, what I've seen is that a number of AI companies will, you need new approval if you want to change your claims. And a lot of AI companies will fix their sensitivity, specificity, whatever number they're using as their claim at a certain level. And they may improve their algorithm and revalidate their algorithm. And so long as the claim doesn't change, the algorithm can improve, but they're not allowed to say that it's any better as long as they can show that validation. And that seems to be happening across a lot of areas, which is the sort of in between to save you having to pull devices off market or being able to release too slowly, which seems to be accepted for the time being by a lot of regulatory frameworks. But there is a lot of discussion in the US currently about AI products and how to do, I guess, live learning in AI and what the regulatory framework needs to adapt to be to make that happen. But it's still, I think, the Wild West in terms of regulatory. And I think it's going to be a long time before we have a regulatory system that aligns well with, I guess, the cutting edge of AI. As somebody who's got regulated product, we still need to put out a dossier about the risk of poisoning from a software product. I think there's a lot to be done to get things up to date with the realities of software as a medical device.
Yeah. But just remember that regulation is the bare minimum. So
Sure.
when you are a clinician looking to deploy something, being approved by the TGA is, the bare minimum. So actually what someone like me is interested in, I would take regulatory approval as a given. What is actually important when we compare drugs, for example, so 3 hypertensive, all approved by TGA, but there are nuances and reasons why you would choose one over the other that are nothing to do with regulatory approval. So I think we need to move a little bit up from regulatory approval and actually start to think about performance and clinical outcomes. So I understand why regulatory issues are important for developers, but that is the bare minimum. And clinicians are actually going to demand more than regulatory approval in order to deploy at scale, the same way they do from their medicine. So a TGA tick of approval does not mean we're going to deploy a medicine or a device, and the same will apply to software. So we need to think beyond regulatory approval. That's the bare minimum for a clinician. It's a given. What is more important to us is that next step, which is how we choose which antihypertensive we're going to prescribe or which device we're going to use, is beyond regulation, Elliot. So I'd suggest that that's a bare minimum. And actually, we need to be thinking more about those outcomes that are actually going to change the way we work and provide adoption at scale. So regulation is important and critical. It's your entry. But after that, then, is how we choose all other clinical decisions, is clinical outcomes in the real world. So I do think we need to think beyond regulation.
Definitely agree.
Interesting. So we're coming to question and answer time from the audience, and we're actually getting some great questions through. So unless anyone has any final comments, we might get stuck into those, if that's good. Excellent. So we have our first question here from Matthew Bell. He says, to what degree is poor consumer engagement with AI an issue of terminology? For most, an understanding of AI is based on movies, iRobot, HAL, etc. People in the industry know that this is a representation of artificial general intelligence as opposed to what is actually being used, which is artificial narrow intelligence, which is such an important distinguishing factor, yet it's almost never discussed. And I agree. I think that's definitely an issue, is that it's the mainstream concept of what AI is. So yeah, would love to hear your comments on that question. Yeah, anyone go for it.
I'll jump in.
Yeah, no worries.
So I guess the way we start our conversations with all customers, and we don't deal with consumers, is we go through a couple of really basic slides on what AI is and what it is today, and why we think it's at the right point of to adopt it, because we now just make the assumption that everybody has misconceptions, which usually aren't correct. They're based on old data or movies or something else. And so the first thing we do is we set the record straight with where we see where it's at, what it can do, what it can't do, and yeah. So I think discussion is the main way to tackle that. Just be upfront. Has anyone else got any comments?
Anyone else? Yeah.
I was just thinking of a sort of analogous situation in surgical robotics, because, I mean, we contracted out with working with our private providers. Patients often specifically ask for robotic prostatectomy, robotic nephrectomy, or whatever use case, some of the gynae surgeries. And to say that a robot has got good evidence is problematic. With my urology colleagues, we were looking at the business case, certainly for prostates is there. But some of the other surgeries, laparoscopic is equivalent or better in some circumstances. Nevertheless, you know, you get people coming in asking for the robot. And so I think that kind of cuts both ways. There is a glamour of the new, which when you actually test it, the new drug bias, the new robot bias, it's on a computer, so it must be better than, you know, we do get quite a lot of patients, certainly in my experience, asking for the new shiny thing, even if the old treatment was better.
Wow. Very interesting.
That was an excellent question, and it basically emphasizes the point that most consumers and majority of patients will understand AI as, you know, the Terminator or Star Wars or Star Trek or whatever, and don't really. I mean, if you asked any patient if they knew what the term narrow AI was, they would be shaking their head. So, and that's really, you know, what's being used primarily in healthcare. Most of the algorithms that we use are focused on, you know, very, very narrow applications. But we never spend the time to explain it to the patients. I mean, who has the time to do that?
Mm-hmm. Do you think that's the responsibility of any other organizations? I mean, should we have AI in education as a standard now, and you know, or in medical school, or, you know, this is something we're also talking about at the hub?
So, I mean, we've definitely done that in Griffith. I'm sure Claire's done something similar at UQ as well, but we built it into the medical school curriculum from day one. And in the first 2 years, they do clinical decision making, and I help teach on that. And we include personalized medicine, population medicine, and yes, AI is in there. I find grabbing them at 18 is the time to do it, because getting them off their smartphones is a challenge. But to engage them, it is a popular thing. And ironically, by the time they're 20, whatever it is, 3 coming out of medical school, they seem to have forgotten some of the principles. So we've kind of embedded it in the first couple of years, and then we've dedicated 5 to 10% of their marks to their during each course bit into this clinical decision making, so that it's kind of it runs all the way through, but they get a concentrated bit when they're young and impressionable.
Cool. That's really cool to hear.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you know, as a company that does a lot of work with consumers, patients and otherwise, I definitely think the education piece there is just so critical. You know, I think the comments you made, Russell, about asking for the robot are very true. And, you know, we work with a lot of rural patients, and health literacy and technology literacy out in rural areas is, you know, much lower. And a lot of our work is on clear and concise communication to patients in a way that allows them to make health decisions that they actually understand. And, you know, I think naming in the medical space it has a lot of weight behind it. We've seen, you know, certain things that used to be called skin cancers no longer have the word cancer attached to them. There's discussion about, is Gleason grade 6 prostate cancer really worthy of the title cancer, because if a patient hears the word cancer, they say, get this out of me. And if there is strong evidence, say Gleason grade 6 prostate cancer, that perhaps the costs outweigh the benefits, then we need to think very carefully about how we're using words, especially, you know, doctors working in a position of power with their patients, and having that responsibility to, I guess, choose words carefully so that patients are making informed decisions and are not getting wrapped up in the ideas of the Terminators or the robots, and can make decisions based on evidence as much as is appropriate.
Fantastic. Good answers to that question, I think. So we'll get to the next question then. We have another one that says, where are the incentives to adopt AI in the healthcare system in Australia? And do you think that they are ultimately strong enough to overcome the barriers discussed by the panel to see broad scale adoption?
I'm happy to take that. So there are no special incentives. So what you have to do is demonstrate value, the same way that I've outlined previously. So all investments in healthcare are now geared towards the quadruple aim. So if you can show that your innovation is satisfying one or more of the quadruple aims, it will get airtime. Then you have to go through the implementation and the rest of it. So I don't think there's a special incentive. The incentive is improving outcomes and satisfying the quadruple aim of healthcare. So you need to be careful that whatever you're doing in health is targeted towards those outcomes. That's where you see successful innovation. And time again, we've seen that innovations that are targeted towards outcomes rather than the product themselves succeed. So it needs to be very clear what those outcomes are and how you're targeting them and how you'll deliver on them. And I think when we start, the industry still is in infancy. It's still very entrepreneurial. We don't have those systems in place. So we need to shift our mindset away from the product themselves to the outcomes and demonstrate that back to the system. And then we will start to see change at scale. But I cannot emphasize enough the criticality of that being the outcome and not the product itself. And so shifting the industry towards an outcomes focused industry will ensure its success and its sustainability. A product focused industry, and we've seen this and Russell's alluded to it, will not succeed because the products themselves are not of interest to healthcare. What is of interest to healthcare, very outcomes driven, is that quadruple aim. So shifting ourselves and maturing ourselves from product-based focus to outcome-based focus, I think we'll see deployment at scale. We saw that with the introduction of EMRs. We saw that with the introduction of other new technologies such as the prostate robots. So I'm sure AI will get there. It's just that we're in that maturation curve at the moment. So hang in there, it'll happen.
Can I kind of add a little bit of spice to the discussion? I don't actually think that government healthcare services around the world, and I've worked in a few, are the right place to incentivize it. Governments, AI hubs, industry, healthcare systems are good at certain things. They're not good in terms of all sorts of reasons why, but they don't do it very well worldwide. You know, that everyone showcases the one thing they've done well, but generally it's slow and tough work and all the rest of it. So, you know, having industry, AI hubs and the kind of way that we're going, I think is a better model than trying to do it inside a large public government healthcare part of the government. It's just not geared up, whereas the governance stuff, the value-based healthcare, which I'm super keen on. I actually run a value-based healthcare unit for exactly that reason. And we put all our innovations and our current practices through that value-based healthcare unit, including with economists, in order to run, not whether it's a robot or an AI or a drug or whatever. It's just, you know, are we delivering what the patients want and need? They expect safety. So we have a bit of a struggle with safety because patients just expect it. And we have to argue the case, which isn't a financially viable case sometimes, to say, no, this is the safe thing to do. they want quality. So I don't know if you agree, Claire. I was trying to be controversial, but you look like
No,
you're
I
agreeing.
agree.
Oh no.
I agree. So, sorry. No, I think you're right. And so that outcomes, but when you think about a new industry, that's difficult because everyone's focused on their product, right? So how do you shift to those outcomes? And that requires partnerships. It requires working together rather than in silos. So I think we will see that happen. We're starting to see it happen already. And I think that's exciting. So I don't share Russell's pessimism. I'm perhaps a little bit more optimistic, but that, you know, I have to be. So I am optimistic about it, but I think it has to be a partnership model that's outcomes driven. And I think that's when we'll start to see change at scale. And I think that is really promising.
Cool. And I have I think a really interesting question here to just move forward because we have a few. Zygmunt Spack, I hope I said that name all right. I think this is a great question. To what degree do you think medical practitioners need explainable AI? That is, to what degree do medical practitioners want to understand the basis upon which AI's prediction or decisions are made?
Claire, do you want that one? I don't know who wants that one. I can talk about it because this is the clinical decision stuff and medical reasoning that we teach is exactly all about that. It should just be embedded into the reasoning. There are certain things that you need an explainer within the model to help the clinical decision-making process. And there's times when you don't need that. So it's like an adjunct. So for example, if a patient deteriorates, there's a Mimic and a whole bunch of these now that spot patient deterioration in hospital. And I know Sunny Coast are working on that across Queensland Health. You know, just knowing a patient's going to deteriorate in 2 days' time doesn't help you treat them. You need a little bit of, what is it that's going to deteriorate? You know, is it going to be their blood pressure dropping? Are they septic?
Yeah.
And you know, the 4-hour deterioration thing is relatively easy. You know, when a patient's about to fall off the perch, but predicting it beyond 24 hours, you have to have diagnosis, therapeutics. You have to have all these other things. So short-term predictors where you just treat the blood pressure, treat the pulse, you know, ICU, intensive care type medicine, doesn't necessarily require the complexities of diagnosis and clinical decision making, and certainly those models get less accurate when you go past 4 hours into the 24-hour mark, and then you actually need someone making a diagnosis, which means you have to have a whole bunch of other information rather than just the blood pressure, pulse, temperature, SATs, things like that. So it's not a straight line, and it's as Claire was saying about the endocrine ward rounds. I don't pretend to understand endocrinology or even diabetes. It's a dark art of insulins. But you know, I think it should, like from a clinician side, it should be embedded in the medical school curriculum, and I've practically done that myself. And there are certain decisions where you need an explanation of what's going on, and there's others where you can let the machine ping and then choose what to do afterwards.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else have comments on that question?
Yeah, I can briefly comment on the AI side. I mean, causality in machine learning and AI is an incredibly complex topic, and I think even on a technical level where there's a long way to go to really crack this. I think the way that we are thinking about this is, and that sort of aligns a little bit with what Russell is saying around, okay, really identifying which parts of the workflow need that explanation and which parts don't, and basically build your product in a way that, well, we have focused a large part where I think the explanation is less relevant because we know there is another human radiologist in the loop to make an actual diagnosis. I mean, that being said, the question that we get from radiologists, often they do want to know where sort of our products predictions are coming from. And I mean, what we currently offer is a lot of contextual information just to help radiologists understand the context in which the AI makes a decision. But we are not making a claim that there's any causation here, because I think that's a strong claim that I think very few people can actually substantiate at this stage. But the context is very helpful. So we give some regions of interest, some other context around the woman being screened, and typically we find that helpful enough in our use case, in our part of the workflow.
Yep, fantastic. No one else has any other comments. We'll look at one of our other questions here, which I think is also quite interesting. Medical AI tools are often touted as decision support tools, which are meant to inform a clinician. However, some research has shown that people tend to defer to decision tools because people don't want to contradict a calculator and be found out to be wrong. So does the panel see this kind of risk arising in medical AI applications?
Yes. Just to kick that off.
Yeah, sure. Please elaborate.
I mean, there's some research recently that is looking at, even simple assistive tools after a while, when they're even meant to be second reads, for example, clinical behavior, especially in high throughput workflows, tends to defer more to the assistant over time. And I guess people lose their skepticism over time and become more comfortable. And certainly that's where errors can arise. And I think any of these systems need to be designed very carefully to make sure that that doesn't happen. And it's even simple things like who reads the scan first? Is it the AI or the clinician? Do they get to see each other's results, and at what point? And all of that stuff, I think, as we alluded to earlier tonight, is beyond just having that model and having that accuracy. That's where this design problem of AI in the healthcare system really comes to light, is how do we bring it into the clinical environment in a way that makes the most use of whatever its performance metrics are in that real world, real patient, real data clinical scenario.
That reminds me of the, was it a Google car hitting the black clothed cyclist in the dark? And she was sitting there on her phone. I'm not saying that clinicians ever use their mobile phones, because they wouldn't.
Yeah. Very interesting. Yeah. Any other comments on that question?
I think part of this is maturing the understanding around AI and decision support. So, for example, when we look at a blood test, it comes with a reference range. And sometimes clinicians will look at a blood test and it will be outside the reference range, and they will act on it. Sometimes it's normal in the reference range, but you can still see that the consumer has an issue. So I think same with radiology reports. Sorry to say, Meng, they might report that the pituitary looks normal, but actually when we go and look in there, there's a honking great tumour. So I think that we shouldn't underestimate the ability of clinicians to discern. They are used to interpreting decision support material from the path lab, from the radiology lab. And I think this is about normalizing AI as just another one of those diagnostic tools. So none of us who are any sort of, I guess, specialist clinician in their area would accept a pathology test or a radiology test for a critical decision without looking at it with a level of skepticism. And so I think that that same healthy skepticism of decision support that we apply currently to pathology and radiology simply needs to be applied to AI. And so I think it's about normalizing it, Steph, about taking it out of a special box, just making it one of the many tools that we use, just like the blood tests, just like the x-rays. It's another tool. We need to understand how it works. We need explainability. Some of the nerd clinicians like Russell will want to know the code. Some of the normal clinicians won't care. So long as Russell and Claire say it's okay, they'll be right. So there's a range of people. And so we just need to be able to cater to all of those, be transparent, allow people to deep dive as much as they want or not, and just put it in our toolkit along with our blood tests and our x-rays.
Mm-hmm. I think it's a great way of looking at it and describing it even to the patients. It's just another tool in the toolkit. Yeah. Great. We have another one here, possibly last one, depending on how we go. So Victor Crespo says, one of the blockers in adopting AI, especially for businesses in Australia, is the lack of Australian-centred data sets to train the algorithms. Is that also a common barrier in healthcare? And how has that issue affected the deployment of AI in some of the examples you shared?
I
Meng, I don't know if you want to take that.
We probably need about 3 hours to answer this.
Yes, we'll have another panel. Yeah.
Yeah. So the ownership of data and the sharing, I was on a call this afternoon between Alfred Health and Monash University, because we were trying to develop a natural language processing approach using Cogstack to produce a clinical trials matching software for clinical trial, and the ability for even a hospital and an affiliated university to share the data is very difficult. So it's probably more difficult in Australia, and this is in every field of AI, not just in healthcare, but in Australia in particular, it's very difficult to share data. I think and the other concept is that it's not really even clear to any of us who the real custodian of the data is. If I was a patient at Alfred Health, I would argue that any electronic medical data or any imaging that was done on me at Alfred Health belongs to me. And if you use that data to develop an algorithm that becomes a commercial product, well, then I'm also, should be apportioned to some of the proceeds of the algorithm that becomes commercialized. So does the data then belong to the hospital? Does the data belong to the university that develops the algorithm? So those are questions that are still unanswered, and we could spend hours and hours discussing the governance of data and the sharing of data. But currently, I think, and probably rightly so, I think it's very strict and probably should remain so until we develop, understanding of who owns data and governance over this data.
And I think that's interesting where, the advanced technology really intersects with those kinds of issues on custodianship and patient privacy, because, I'm sure most of you, have, thought about, federated learning and those sorts of technologies where you can train algorithms without whoever's building that algorithm actually ever seeing that data or accessing it themselves. So, I really think that's a fascinating area too, is looking at how these advanced technologies that we can use to build algorithms and AI tools can actually support enhancing privacy of research, and that it doesn't always need to be this linear data is handed over to people and something is built. How can we make it more efficient through using advanced technologies, especially when it comes to accessing large data sets, because that is actually important in making the algorithm safer, is accessing more data, which is ironic because often you think of more data access as more risk, but it's kind of inversed in this case. So I think that's an idea that I'm definitely passionate about people being aware of. So any other comments on that issue?
Yeah, I mean, if I can speak to perhaps a nuance in that question that I think is of importance is the comment on Australian-centered data sets. Because we've seen in a number of cases in AI applications, health and otherwise, that just because an algorithm works well on one population doesn't mean it works well on others. And certainly, algorithms that have been taken from a, country where the population is homogeneous in one respect to another, where genetically, physically, whatever else, there are differences in those populations, we see algorithm performance drop. And without proper consideration for that, you can see significant changes in performance. And that has the opportunity, obviously, to create health harms. And often what we see is that in minority populations where data is perhaps less readily available, they are often at the tail end of the stick. They end up worse off because there's no data available to train on those populations, which means that the algorithm perhaps is biased against them in one way or another, and that can have severe health outcomes. And I think certainly, in Australia and anywhere else, I think it's really important to understand how algorithms perform locally and across different populations, because, medically, different populations function differently, and we need to be catering for that.
Yeah, go ahead, Russell. Thanks, Elliot.
So, yeah, no, I totally agree with that bias and all the problems that you get. There is, and I'm going to be, because I was described as a pessimist by Claire earlier, I will say that there is the opportunity in most areas of health inequality for AI to have a very significant impact. I'm not saying that it will, but the opportunity is really tantalizing with, and I remember at Health Hack, we had some people who were helping with some translation, real-time translation stuff. They were using Auslan to translate, whether it's people who haven't had the opportunities of health education. We've struggled and we've employed lots and lots of systems to overcome health inequality. However, we do see the inverse care law very commonly. If you run a screening program, normally the healthy ones come to the front of the queue, and the ones that probably, and we see this in bowel screening, the uptake in well-educated people is there. Whereas if you could reorganize the system to provide care to the most in need first, there is real opportunities to overcome health inequality.
Yeah, absolutely.
Really interesting.
And I think it just, requires being conscious of that when we're building those tools for sure. So we're pretty much at the end of our session today. So any final comments from anyone? I mean, I'm sure we could talk about this for hours. It was a fantastic conversation, and I thank you all again for coming along and having your input on this topic. I mean, just to summarize, I guess it's great to hear that you're all very optimistic about the research and the developments that are happening in Australia and in the field of medical research and clinical research. Some of these tools are being implemented into the healthcare system, but, we still have a long way to go. But, there are solutions in educating, not only the people who are going to be using it in their respective fields, but also patients, and also looking at different ways that we can approach the healthcare system to demonstrate value to incorporating these technologies in. So long road ahead, but exciting and very promising. So I think that's fantastic. So I'll close off the session now. And to the audience, thanks for hanging in. I know it was a long session, but I think it was very interesting. I know that some of you asked questions that didn't get answered, but we will attempt to get those answered for you or get a response. There were some questions about slides or interacting with the AI Hub, and we'll get back to you on that. Thanks again to AI Advance for supporting us with this event, and IntelliHQ and obviously the AI Hub. It's been really good to be able to run this sort of thing. And, if anyone, any of the people who are listening want to be involved more with the AI Hub or learn more about AI for healthcare, you can look on our website. Thought that might happen. So I have my webcam here. So feel free to check out our website. We do have events coming up, and we also have other things such as an accelerator. So Twitter, LinkedIn, all of that sort of thing, you'll be able to find all of that information. So thanks again for everyone. We'll close off now, and I hope you all have a good rest of your evening or morning if you've tuned in from overseas. Thanks.
Thanks everyone. Have a
See you
good
later.
night.
Thanks everyone. Bye.
Thanks for joining us.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.